So we've been talking about money, and some of you are like, well, why do we have to talk about money? And I get it, because most of the time when pastors or churches talk about money, we say the same thing that everybody else does. We say, we need more money. And it's awkward, and it's true. Like if we had more money, we could do more ministry. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about two massive, unignorable facts. The first is that if you're like most Americans, you actually think an awful lot about money already. Most of us probably think about money more than we think about heaven. We think about money more than we think about hell. And money is a blessing, money is a curse, and we're going to talk about both. But for lots of us, money is a problem. You probably know this, but financial conflict remains a leading cause of divorce. Money actually rips families apart. Money messes kids up. Money causes mistrust, broken relationships. It is a cause for anxiety, depression, and worry. And if you don't believe me, last week I listed some of the facts and some of the stats and studies and news reports about student loans and household debts and all the problems that it is causing in our country. But this week I'm just going to state the obvious. Money is an unavoidable topic in all of our hearts. The second, though, and maybe just as surprising, is that the Bible, this book, actually talks a lot about money. Jesus, believe it or not, talks more about money than about heaven. Jesus talks about money more than he talks about hell, and we have a lot to learn. And because the Bible talks a lot about money, and most of us could probably use a little bit of divine insight on how to think about this massive, sometimes blessing-enabling, sometimes problem-starting, anxiety-stemming issue in all of our hearts, we have a lot to learn. Money, believe it or not, is actually everywhere in the pages of this book. So because we think about money a lot, we should listen to some of what the Bible says about it. If you were here last week, we started thinking about money by saying one main point. Does anyone remember what it was? We said, guess what? You're already, somebody, rich, which is a surprise. You know, a few years ago, there was a news report. Bill Gates, who was at the time the richest man in the entire world, was getting started. He retired from Microsoft, and he started off in philanthropy. And he began by visiting this incredibly poor, impoverished Indian village. And he had a translator, and he was interviewing some of the world's poorest people. And he was asking how he could help. And it was Bill Gates, of course. So along with Bill Gates, there were cameras and journalists. And as he leaves this village, the journalist stays around and asks this woman, one of the poorest people in the world, asked a question. So he said, ma'am, what was it like to have the world's richest man in your house? Bill Gates was here. And she just goes, I don't know, everybody in the West they're all rich. It's crazy, right? From her perspective, you, and me, and Bill Gates were in the same category. But she's right. I mean, financially speaking, the gap between us and Bill Gates, which seems huge, it's actually about the same size gap as the difference between us and a bunch of the world's impoverished population. And we forget about this. We forget how fortunate we are. We don't think we're rich because rich is a moving target. No matter how much money you have or how much money you make, you'll never consider yourself rich because do you know what rich is? Well, most people define it, it's really easy. Rich is more than what I have. Right? And if that's your definition, you never will arrive at being rich. And it's so funny, in our country, we spend so much time trying to become rich or hang on to what we have, we hardly ever stop, count our blessings, and realize that we are rich. Anybody take the global wealth test I gave last week? Okay, a couple of you. If you did, you would have realized how incredibly wealthy everyone in this room is compared to the world's population right now, let alone history. In fact, today, if you're more worried about losing weight than you are about starving, you're rich. If you're upset in any way about a sports team, traffic, cars, having pumpkin spices in your coffee, you should know that a good chunk of people globally wish they could have your problems, and they'll only dream about your complaints. And I get to hear a lot of complaints, and let me tell you, most of you have rich people problems. And here's why I've worked so hard at making this point. If you're rich, and you're all rich, you have a lot of responsibility. Simply having things doesn't make you good at managing things. So we need to look at Scripture and see what God says about how to have the wealth management skills that might match the level of our possessions. And what I think is, once you realize that you're already rich, you all have some work to do. We have to learn how to live richly. So we've been looking at 1 Timothy 6:17, and last week we read it really quick, and I hit you with about 3 or 4 big ideas from this verse. This week, I'm going to kind of circle back and focus on just one of these big ideas. This is what God has for us. And we're going to start talking, eventually we're going to start talking about how to manage being rich, what to do with what God's given you. But first, we're going to start in kind of a different spot. Being good at being rich, it's not just a matter of learning how to manage what to do with your money. You also have to be concerned and warned about what your money is doing to you. Did you know that? Money actually has an effect on your heart. The old saying is that the key is to possess things without things possessing you. And that's exactly the point that Paul makes to Timothy, that we're going to unpack a bit today. This is 1 Timothy 6:17. Paul writes, "Command those who are rich in this present world," that's you, by the way, "not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain." We glossed over this really quickly last week, but this week I want to slow down and think about what God is telling us here. Money, it seems, has the potential to do something bad to you. And later we'll talk about some of the good things it does. It enables you and blesses you. But today, we start off with a warning. Some of the danger that comes with the territory, the more you have, the easier it is to lose touch with reality. To be really specific, what you have has the potential to tempt you in 2 different ways. First, and you see it, right? It has the potential to make you prideful, arrogant. Second, over time, money wages this war in your heart to become a primary source of hope. And it starts to leave the impression that we are self-sufficient, that we don't need anyone else or anything. Wealth has its own gravitational pull. Being rich, and you're all rich, it's like trying to swim across a river. And you may not see it, but there's a certain pull in a direction. And if you're rich, and you're all rich, you have to learn how to compensate toward this pull, toward pride and isolation. And it's not terribly complicated, right? This problem is as basic as human nature. Deep down, we all wrongly think that our identities, who you are, is defined by what you have. So we think, and we're wrong, that you are what you have. You don't really have to be that sophisticated to know this. I learned this in high school. I remember high school. The guys were defined by, of all things, what kind of sneakers they wore. It seems so silly now, right? But I was that guy in high school. It was the 90s, and after dreaming and longing toward this day, I got a pair of Nike Air Jordans, and it was awesome. I was the man, and I'm not even kidding. I could not wait for people to notice what I had, even though I acted like I didn't notice that people noticed. But anyone else have rocking shoes back in the day? Some guys are nodding. That's great. It seems so silly, right? But do you remember how much better you felt about yourself when you walk in and you're wearing those 2 overpriced slabs of leather and strings and glue with a swish stitched on the side. It was, man, I was a man. Like, guys, remember that? Ladies, do you remember back? I have no idea what ladies remember, but I know that from early on, all of us start measuring who we are by what you have. And if you have a lot, and we all have a lot, we get drawn to starting to think more of ourselves than we should because we start trusting what we have. That's the first thing wealth does to you. But the second thing wealth does to you is worse than the first. There's something worse than just being prideful. According to Paul, when you're rich, there is this natural pull on your heart. There's an inclination in your heart for your hope and trust to migrate toward money. It doesn't even sound that bad, right? Like, I hope I could pay my bills. I hope I could share with others. I hope I could save for the future. And money helps with those hopes. But that's not what Paul's talking about. That's okay. Putting your hope in riches is something entirely different. It's one thing to have hope and riches. It's another thing entirely, though, to start trusting what you have. When what you have is what you trust, the source of hope, you're actually set up for something really dangerous. You're headed down a slippery slope, and eventually you start to think that what you have can meet all of your needs, and it can't. That's what Proverbs 18 talks about. Proverbs 18 says, and I'll start in verse 10. It says, "The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run to it. They're safe." So far, so good, right? On the other hand, though, the wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it a wall too high to scale. You see what Proverbs says? So on one hand, for believers, we have this incredible divine hope. God is trustworthy. Christ is enough, we sang. God won't let you down. You are ultimately kept safe in life, in death, and everything in between if you hope in God. And it doesn't mean everything's easy. We stumble, we fall, but life in this fortified tower, this mighty fortress, isn't easy, but we can hope in God to keep us safe. We say that a lot, right? That's what this cross symbolizes. This is our hope. We have safety given to God's people at the high cost of the life of God's own Son. We believe we could run to Jesus, and Jesus keeps us safe. Oh, and by the way, today is the Reformation. You should know this exact thing is a major theme in the Protestant Reformation, that we discover that God is rich, God is generous, and we have nothing to offer this God. It gives us humility. Part of Reformed teaching is that you can't earn God's love. You can't. All you could do is choose. Or all you could do is receive God's love. So we sing songs like, "Nothing in my hands I bring, simply to the cross I cling." Or another one, "Not what my hands have done can save my guilty soul." I think the next verse is, "Thy work alone, O Christ, can ease this weight of sin." In other words, God is rich, God is strong, He's generous, and we should hope in Him. And that's what we say a lot. The problem is, when you're rich, and you're all rich, we get drawn to start hoping in wealth, which is so uncertain, Paul says. When you're rich, you go, okay, I know God is a mighty fortress, a fortified tower, but you know what? I don't need that because I got a safety net. And money can solve a whole bunch of my problems because I've learned that if I have a problem, I could solve a lot of things with money, and it works. The problem is, eventually, the temptation for us is to start forming an association between hope and money. And the danger is that eventually we could get drawn to think that there is some amount of money large enough to hope in. And you'll notice that the author of Proverbs says that the rich imagine, see that word? They imagine that their wealth is a wall too high to scale. In other words, they actually think that what they have can keep them safe forever. And they could hope in it, they could trust in it. And it becomes that thing that they hope in instead of God. But the author of Proverbs says it's just a fantasy. There's no amount of stuff you could get that can protect you from everything. You may know that Proverbs are thought to be spoken by King Solomon, who is known for being the wisest and wealthiest man ever to live. He was King David's son. You just right here heard his story. I mean, he starts off putting his hope in God. God blessed him with wealth. And you know what happened next, right? He started giving in to the dual gravitational pulls of pride and false hope. And you know Solomon's story. He ends up being isolated, alone. He didn't have close friends. And if you know his story, you know that he really struggled with his family. He had multiple dysfunctional marriages. He didn't raise his kids well. And in the end, he lost it all because he hoped, he imagined that what he had was a wall tall enough to protect him. The wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it a wall too high to scale, but it's not. That's the story of Solomon. It's also a warning to all of us, rich people, that the gravitational pull of wealth can pull us toward pride. And if you hope in it, you'll discover that it cannot ultimately meet your needs. Oh, and by the way, you don't actually have to be a Christian or a person of faith to believe this. You all know that it doesn't actually work to count on money for your hope. Even MasterCard, right, the credit card company, admits that there are things money can't buy. I mean, it can't buy the priceless things in life. Because there comes a time when money can't buy hope either. There's no amount of money that can guarantee you hope in any and all circumstances. Proverbs also concludes, later on, he says that he'd rather not be rich at all and to avoid the trap of hope and pride. This is Proverbs 30, 8 and 9. It's a prayer, right? God, the Proverbs author says, would you keep falsehood and lies far from me? Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I might have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God. It's like that old song, right? I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. That's basically what the Proverbs author says, which brings us all the way back to Paul's warning about the potential for riches to displace the hope that we're supposed to have in Christ. Being rich, and you're all rich, has some pretty potent side effects. It's dangerous. I'm thinking about Solomon. I almost think if wealth were an over-the-counter medicine, you'd get it with bold warnings on the packaging. Like, warning may cause arrogance. While taking this medicine, extra precautions should be taken not to offend people. If taken for prolonged periods, it may impair perception, causing hope to migrate. I think if you saw a commercial for wealth on TV, you'd probably see one of these scenes of happy people holding hands in the park. Meanwhile, the announcer would be listing all the ways that wealth might mess you up. This product may cause increased stress, anxiety, cause conflict, cause strained marriages, family. That's how it should be advertised. In fact, I'll bet some of you look back longingly on days long gone when people used to talk to their neighbors instead of driving right into their garages. Do you remember back when people spent time together instead of rushing to their next scheduled events? Do you remember when we used to go to people's houses and people would talk instead of staring at cell phones? You may remember way back when our culture was less lonely, we were less busy, less stressed, back when people had to learn how to talk to each other instead of having the luxury of avoiding people we disagree with. You may remember when we as a culture were poorer and we didn't have as much. In some ways, maybe we were richer back then because we had more. Wealth does something to you. It has the potential to make you prideful. It can isolate you. It can convince you that you can ultimately hope in it in a way that's dangerous to you. But it doesn't have to be that way. Paul actually explains to you something that will change everything. Paul explains it, and I'll read it. You should know these verses by now. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. And you all should be very familiar with that verse by now. But here's a solution. But to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Do you see it? I mean, the way to offset the potential side effects of wealth, the way to avoid pride and putting too much trust or hope in uncertain things like wealth, well, the solution is simple. Put your hope in God. Well, to be fair, that's a short answer. We'll have more to say about this next week. But it seems so simple, right? But I'll bet you know people who've done this. Some rich people who, no matter how much God sends their way, it doesn't mess them up. It doesn't change them. They're able to have a lot without putting their hope in it. We know people who are middle-class rich. There are millionaires. There are people who are maybe just rich only compared globally. But there are people who, no matter how much God blesses them, they're able to not trust in it because they put their hope in God. And when you hope in God, when God is your mighty fortress, it's just amazing. You don't suffer from the first thing Paul warns us about, arrogance. And even when you're rich, you're able to avoid the gravitational pulls, and you're able to be humble and thankful and generous in your heart. You don't have to have a lot of anxiety or worry when your hope is in the Lord. Because when your hope is in the Lord, like if that's what you're hoping in, you can be steady no matter what comes your way. How do you even begin hoping in the Lord? What practically can you do in order to put your hope in this mighty fortress? Well, look what Paul says next. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. There you go. A step-by-step plan for keeping your hope from migrating. So just imagine, what would that look like in your life? I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Because it's really hard to be arrogant if you're trying to think up things to do that are good, right? And it'd actually kind of be hard to be rich in good deeds and generous and willing to share if you're also putting all your hope in the things that you're so generously sharing. Actually, I want to give you a simple mantra, and I'm going to ask you to repeat it. This is from Andy Stanley, who just loves these things, and credit where credit is due. I really don't know that much about money. I'm learning a lot this last month or two. For today and for a bunch of these sermons, I'm leaning really heavily on Andy Stanley and some other resources that I've put in your bulletin. They deserve a lot of the credit for what you're hearing this morning, including this. Here it is. You put the slide up yet next. I will not trust in riches, but in him who richly provides. Actually, can we say that together? I want you to remember this. I will not trust in riches, but in him who richly provides. One more time. I will not trust in riches, but in him who richly provides. You know, I'm convinced that this one simple shift in your mindset, this could hold the key to being good at being rich. Wealth has side effects. And ironically, the things that could mess you up are actually the same things that keep you from being good at being rich. But if you could just start trusting more in the one who gives than what you've been given, you'll not just be better balanced and have better priorities, but it'll also help you have better relationships and less anxiety. But more than that, you'll be able to start receiving and uses God's rich provision. And I love what he says about that he gives for your enjoyment. But you'll be able to use what you have now to make a difference for eternity. So, Father, I pray that you would help us not to trust in riches, but to trust in him who richly provides. I pray that whether you've given us a lot or given us a little, that you would help us to be humble, to help us to put our hope in you. And as you bless us, may we be grateful and manage what we have well. I pray that you would teach this to us, teach it to our kids. I pray that you would help us as a culture to have less stress and to love others more. Father, as we close this service, I think about those who need encouragement. I pray for folks like Brian Brown, who are wrestling with his identity and depression. I pray that you would today give him and all those who are struggling hope in you. Father, I ask that you would bless your word to us. May it bear fruit, and may we learn to trust in you, our fortified tower, our mighty fortress. Amen.